Welcome to Vermont Artists and Authors, where we interview great storytellers and artists from the amazing Green Mountain State. I'm your host, Barney Smith of StoryComic.com, and we're honored to have with us the award-winning and internationally acclaimed author, Bill Schubart. You've written many volumes called the Lamoille Stories, and I live in Lamoille County. You've also done a lot of other books. You've also a founder of many institutions. You've been on boards. You truly are a Vermont institution that you've touched a lot of aspects of the arts and the sciences in Vermont as well.
I'm 78 years old, so it's part of it's just longevity. But for the first time in my life, I'm not serving on any boards. I'm board.
You know, I usually tell people when they move to Vermont, I said, give yourself 2 weeks. Someone's going to knock on your door and ask you to join a board. So
absolutely. Yep.
As of recent, you do have a lot of books have come out over the years, and you kind of started doing a lot of these publications. Usually, it looks like since starting around like 2006 and 7. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's. I retired from business in 2008, and I just was ready to move on and do something else, and really wanted to have more time. I was very interested in writing when I was in prep school, and was very lucky and got into a class that was run by a teacher, a writing class in my senior year. And he ended up being a teacher of some really famous American writers, James Agee and a bunch of folks. And that got me very excited about it. And then I went away to college, and I got a short story published in the Great Lakes Review, which again whet my appetite. But when I was in business, I never really had time to write. And so finally, when I quit, I sat down and started writing short stories from tales that I'd heard, around the Uncle Mando's dinner table, and published it, and was very nervous, didn't much know what I was doing. And I went over to a book launch at the library in Morrisville, and it was so crowded they had to move it to the church. And went down to the church, and I was terrified because I wasn't sure that I had hit everybody's names enough. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I was afraid that people would recognize, themselves or other people. And I was sitting there waiting for it to start, and this very large woman got up, and I didn't recognize her. And she said, "Billy Couture, I know every damn person in that book." And I was terrified. And it was my third grade teacher. I was absolutely terrified. But it turned out okay, because whether it's flattering or not, people seem to be happy to be included if they recognize themselves, which a lot of people did.
So would you consider these books, they almost geared a little bit towards memoir or geared towards nonfiction, but these are actually works of fiction technically?
They are works of fiction. I mean, in the Lamoille stories, they're stories that I heard or knew about, as a young person. Stories I'd hear around the dinner table. And they just really stuck with me. And, the French Canadian culture that I grew up in, these people were storytellers. I mean, when you sat around, the dinner table on a Sunday afternoon, you weren't talking about the manure pile or the hay crop or whether your, Ford 8N would start. They were telling stories.
Right.
And boy, they stayed with me.
Why did you decide not to write any memoirs or any nonfiction? You seem to just always, as you said, geared towards mostly the fiction genre.
Yeah, I mean, the closest I ever came to a memoir is a book I wrote called Photographic Memory, which is the worst book I wrote. There's some very interesting stuff in it, and it is as close as I would ever get to a memoir. I'm thinking of pulling it and rewriting it. but there's an awful lot of my own life in there. My life in Morrisville, my time in New York City, relatives. The photographic memory part comes from the fact that Alfred Stieglitz was my great great uncle, and Georgia O'Keeffe was my great aunt.
Mm,
And the family really had a penchant in every generation for making movies, home movies and photography.
right.
I mean, just a staggering amount of photography in every generation.
So talk to us about, you had some sequel books already of Lamoille stories. Were the stories in Lamoille stories, were they the first ones that kind of made the cut, or did you already plan on having sequels to this because you had way too many tales and stories to fit into one book?
It was what you just said. I mean, there were more stories than I could fit. And Lamoille Stories 1 is still my best selling book.
Hmm.
It just keeps selling and selling and selling. And Lamoille Stories 2 sells well too. But there were just more stories, you know. So I just went ahead and did that. And the other collection of short stories, as you see, was Fat People.
Right.
And that was the hardest book I ever wrote.
Hmm.
Um, I used to weigh 485 pounds,
Wow.
and yeah, and I was just hugely obese and very, very addicted to refined carbohydrates. And I wanted, when I lost weight, I lost 240 pounds slowly over 2 years. I wanted to write a book about the experience of being fat. I didn't want to write a diet book. So this
Right.
is short stories, most of which are based in some form of reality. And I so I wrote them because I wanted people to have some sort of understanding and empathy for people who struggle with food, which I
Right.
did all my life. And I was trying to figure out what in God's name and can I use as a cover. And you can't go up and say to a large person, "Excuse me, can I take a picture of you and use you
Right.
use
Yeah.
you on the cover of a book called Fat People?"
Right.
Um, and Kate and I we were on our way to Morocco, and we stopped at the Prado in Spain, and we wanted to see Las Meninas, the great paintings. And I wandered off into a gallery, and I saw this image that is on the cover of Fat People, and it was an 8 foot high painting, Spanish painting done in the late 19th century. And I looked at it and I sat down and I started crying.
Hmm.
It was called La Monstrua Desnuda, the naked
Hmm.
monster. And I looked at this girl's face. This is a 12-year-old girl. I looked at
Wow.
her face and I just saw this total alienation. I mean, why am I trapped in this body? And it hit me so hard. I went up to the office at the Prado and I said, "Can I license that image for the cover of a book I have coming out?" And they said, "Yeah, of course." And I paid them $85, and a high res file showed up at my designer's. And it's problematic. I wouldn't ever change it because it's exactly what I wanted for that cover.
Right.
But it was hard for bookstores, obviously. You don't normally have a book with a picture of a 12-year-old naked girl,
Right.
even though there's nothing sexy about it. It's just hard. But and that book has done really well. That book has sold. It's also become a staple in a couple of medical schools where they have a course called Humanities in Medicine, where they're trying to get doctors to have empathy for their patients, and they do it by teaching literature.
Right.
Anyway, so that became a staple in a couple of those courses. It's a book I needed to write.
Did you write this and some of your other ones? Is this basically some level of therapy for you, or is this some level of necessity to write these?
It's a great question, and I think I think I don't know how to say it other than to say I needed to get stuff out of my head and
Right.
on paper. I needed to expunge a lot of the pain associated with being a fat person
Right.
and try to communicate not in a way that gathers sympathy, but in a way that gathers empathy. You know
Right.
what I mean?
Yeah.
And that was the whole point of writing Fat People. And there was when I went into treatment, not a fancy spa. This was a really dark place in Florida in an abandoned hospital, and an awful lot of the folks there were black, and I was I showed up at 485 pounds, and the first person I met the third day I was there was an 800-pound Catholic priest who
Wow.
came in on a gurney. And that's one of the short stories. It's called Father Bob.
Wow. And what about some of your other ones we've mentioned before about Lamoille, the Lamoille stories? Are those based off of the fact that did you see a vacancy of knowledge and history that you felt it was your duty to write these down?
No, not really. I didn't feel, I mean, there's been a lot of wonderful stuff written about Vermont. Annie
Right.
Prue,
Mm.
who was a good friend when she lived in Burlington, Edward Arlington Robinson, no, I guess it's Ferrisburg, the Rokeby. He wrote some wonderful Vermont short stories. So it's been there was no purpose. I just wanted to
Right.
get these stories out.
Right.
And Lila and Theron is a novel that could have been in Lamoille stories. Lila and Theron was a couple who lived right next to us. We lived on Washington Highway. The house that my
Right.
father and Oscar Churchill built is gone now. It's part of the Copley parking lot.
Jeez.
But
Yeah.
the Volney and Gladys Farr lived in the farm just up the road, and that was where I had my first job at the age of 12.
Okay.
And they were a really wonderful, and that's basically what Lila and Theron is based on.
This was a finalist as well, right? The Independent Book Publishers Association
Oh
Popular
yeah,
Fiction
yeah,
finalists.
yes. But what I think was most interesting is that Simon and Schuster picked up the book on the basis of the manuscript, and it did not go through an agent. They
Wow.
loved it,
Okay.
and they picked it up, and it was designed by a guy in Paris, who has done 2,800 covers. And he read the book and loved it. And he sent me an email and he said, "Do you have an image in mind?" And I sent him this image, Richard Brown, which was black and white. And he colorized it
Oh
and
wow.
made that cover. Yeah.
What's the synopsis? What's the story behind Leela and Theron that you mentioned?
It's funny. It doesn't have, a real narrative arc. It's really their whole life together.
Wow.
They were
Okay.
childless, and it goes right up to both of them dying. And it goes very deep on Lamoille County and Wolcott and Elmore, the logging industry, and what farming was really like.
And once again, Bill, this isn't a work of fiction, even though it almost feels as though it's a nonfiction setting.
Right, but technically it is fiction
Right.
because although it's based on them and there are elements of their life, it's also a lot of it is just made up in my head.
Wow.
You know, I would say they are the inspiration, and there's some accuracy, but it's really a work of fiction.
Fairly similar to when you did your I Am Baby, which is says it's a work of fiction, but it's based off of a true story.
Yeah, this is. I mean, if I could be remembered by any book, it would be this book. I knew this woman really well.
Mm.
She sang for 10 years with her partner, Virginia. They sang together outside the awning at Bloomingdale's on, I think it was 79th and Lex, the big Bloomingdale's,
Right.
and they were tolerated under the awning, which amazed me. And they would sing 6, 8 hours a day in any weather, but they were allowed to sit under the awning at the entrance to. And Baby is one of the most amazing women I ever knew. I was so stunned first by their music that we brought them up and we did an album of them on Philo Records, which won an award from the National Endowment on the Arts. It never didn't sell very much because it was very arcane, kind of white gospel music. But I became very good friends with her, and when she died, I just sat down and wrote the book. And when she was up recording, um, she and her partner, Virginia Brown, were up for 4 days. I just left a recording machine on the whole time we were talking. And she told me a lot of her life story. And I wrote it into the book in honor of her. She was, when I was in New York, she said, "Do you want to come to my service?" And she had the lowest form of preaching license one could get in New York City, which was called an exhorter. And
Mm.
exhorters were typically people who stood out on the street and screamed and yelled about being, saving yourself. And so I took a cab out to Bed-Stuy, and the cab driver said, "Excuse me, white people don't go to Bed-Stuy." And I said,
Mm.
"Well, please take me out there." And he did and dumped me out. And Baby's church was in an abandoned basement in an abandoned building. And I went down there, and there were 6 blind people sitting in folding chairs. And she asked me if I would bring in the donuts, which I did, which were crawling with, bugs.
Right.
And she got up and delivered a sermon on gratitude. And this is a woman who had, from what I could see, nothing to be grateful for.
Right.
She'd been molested as a young girl. Her baby had been taken away from her. And, and she talked about gratitude. And it just made me realize, I absolutely love that woman.
Right. Would this have been a book that you felt like it was really important to be memorialize her and actually writing her story
Yes.
down?
Yes. Yeah. I was afraid that other than the record, which is still available, and if you go deeper into the website, you can actually listen to her music, and there's a whole bunch of photographs of her that I hired a world class photographer who happened to be my cousin, who was the photographer at the New York World's Fair, to spend 2 days just photographing Baby in Virginia.
Mm. So it seems like a lot of your stories, a lot of your books seem to really kind of focus on just like the perseverance of your major protagonists.
Well, I think that's true. I mean, I um, there are people who have made me who I am,
Mm.
and it's sort of a way to pay homage to them. You know what I mean? I don't know how else to say it, and it's interesting because I often get asked about how I write, and I know a lot of writers obviously, and I read a lot of new manuscripts, and people say, "Well, do you make an outline, or do you make a plot outline, or do you make a summary?" And you know how sometimes you learn by just talking and listening to
Yeah.
yourself? It's weird. And I realize what I do is I start out with a very clear character or characters in my mind, and I put them in a place and I start writing, and then they sort of bring me along. It sounds bizarre, but I mean, it's the characters seem to somehow become friends and on a life of their own. And sometimes I just will let them lead me somewhere.
does a fictionalized version of the real life people, do they act differently as you write them, or they pretty much stick to how you envision them to be in real life?
It's really a mixture of both, Barney.
Okay.
It's you know, sometimes I impose on them,
Mm,
and sometimes I don't.
right.
I mean, it just depends. And of course, before I take the work out, as a finished manuscript to critical readers and an editor and so on and so forth, I will probably rewrite anywhere from 5 to 7 times.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
And how does that process work? Do you edit it as you write it, or do you write the whole draft then go back
Yeah.
and
What
edit
I
it
what
again?
I do is, and I learned this early on. I can't write for more than an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours max a day. It's hard work. And so I'll write, maybe 3 or 4 or 5 pages, and then I stop and grab a chainsaw and run into the woods or something, you know, get away from a screen. And then when I come back to write, I pick up where I started writing the day before and read forward and
Wow.
make extensive edits and then write another 3 or 4 or 5 pages.
Mm,
And that way also I get continuity. If I
right.
picked up where I dropped off, you know, um, a parakeet might become a parrot in the fourth chapter, you know. So, and I'm a firm believer in editors. I have no patience for writers who say, "Oh, it's an intensely personal, lonely experience. It's me expressing myself." And writing to me is a collaborative experience. It has to be between you and a reader, and you need collaborators to develop a good manuscript. You need a literary editor, you need critical readers, you need a copy editor, you need a good designer. You know, it's not just me and my ego.
And so, talk to us about your most recent book, The Correctional Facility.
That just haunted me, Barney. I
Mm,
when I went from Morrisville, Vermont, 8th grade to Phillips Exeter Academy, and I didn't even know what Exeter was. And frankly, I went there because my father had gone there.
right.
And I got in, I was there 4 years. And my second year there, I read Dante's Inferno. And of course,
Mm.
being raised a Catholic and totally imbued with guilt about everything, I was absolutely not only thunderstruck, but terrified by the book.
Wow.
And I remember only being able to read it in small doses. So again, it was kind of like I needed the purgative of going back and revisiting it, as
Right.
a 70-year-old instead of a 15-year-old. I went back and read it really carefully. Then I decided that instead of it being hell, which, I was raised with Catholicism, I don't believe there's a hell. And so I transposed it to a correctional facility, and it becomes a tour, of me going through a correctional facility with Walt Whitman, and going through all the different sections and seeing all the different kinds of sin. It uses the same navigation as the Inferno, but it's modern crimes. It's like, you know, all kinds of crimes.
Right.
And the other interesting thing I explored is things that were a sin when I was a kid that are sins and have circles of hell in Dante's Inferno aren't sins anymore.
Mm,
Do you know what I mean? Like
right.
being an atheist or committing suicide,
Right.
or having a divorce,
Hmm.
you know. So that was intriguing to me. What was a sin in Dante's time that is no longer a sin?
That's true. Nobody's going to jail for being an atheist.
I would never say I was an atheist because to me that's
Right.
arrogant. That
Right.
says I know absolutely there's no God.
Right.
I would say more that, I'm agnostic. I don't, if there is a God, I don't know it or understand it.
And so was this also kind of some level of therapy for you to write this book then as well?
I think so. I mean, I keep talking about expungement,
Mm-hmm.
expungement around my addiction to food, my fascination with the county I grew up in. And this was Catholicism.
Right.
And I'll tell you, when I was 13, I knew the mass in French, Latin, and English. I was an altar boy. I was all there.
Right.
And when I went away, and my when I was 17, I took a course over 2 years in which we read every single book of Russian literature that was available in translation. And I read Dostoevsky's The Legend of the Grand Inquisitor,
Oh
which is a
wow.
story within the Brothers Karamazov. And I read the whole book, but I mean, when I hit that short story, inside, I turned away from the Catholic Church and I never went back.
Okay.
That turned me away totally from the Catholic
Mm.
Church. And that was before, all the scandals with pedophilia and everything else.
So, which is really interesting for someone who has written so many books in such a short period of time. Frankly, I'm surprised, Bill, you don't have a COVID project, anything that you wrote.
Well, there's a book that I'm writing now that
Okay.
I'm struggling with. Not It's based on a real life experience that is so unique,
Mm.
not to my family, but to another family, that if I can't preserve the plot and yet make it anonymous, I'm going to have to ask permission of the family to publish the book, even though I've fictionalized it, moved it to a different country. And it's interesting because the genesis is in St. Johnsbury, Vermont. I can't talk
It's
about it yet because I'm still in the midst. I've written about 10,000 words, and I try not to write anything that's over 40,000 words because attention span is shrinking. And I frankly love the idea of a novella. I love short
right.
stories and novellas. And when I pick up a book that weighs more than I do, I'm like, I'm not so sure.
Because, yeah, the correctional facility is a novella.
Yeah, yeah, very much
Yeah.
so. Yeah.
Right. And all your other ones are a collection of short. A lot of your stuff, you're right, is like a collection of short stories. Excellent. So, Bill, if people want to learn more about your work, where's the best place they could go to?
Probably the best thing is on my website. The books are all there. The critical information is there. Where they can get the books is there.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a big fan of local bookstores. I know all the bookstores in Vermont. I work closely with them. I ask people not to buy my book on Amazon, but you can't be a writer and not have your books. So all my books are on Amazon. And I'm not, anti Amazon, but I'm pro independent community bookstore.
Right.
And, so.
Well, listen, Bill, you're gonna have to come back on because, as we were saying before we went live, is like there is so much stuff to talk to you about, and we didn't talk about some of your op-ed pieces. We didn't talk about your musical. There's so much stuff that we haven't even talked about, Bill. But that means you're gonna have to come back on one of these days, and we'll
Well,
continue the
I'm, I
conversation.
I have enjoyed very much our conversation, and